Today we're going to be examining some source material that deals with an incredibly painful and pivotal event in modern history, the September 11th attacks.
And it's just so important that we approach this with the seriousness it deserves.
Absolutely, because woven into that shared trauma is a really profound and a tragic case of identity fabrication.
The documents we're looking at today detail the story of a woman who called herself Tania Head. And she managed to place herself right at the very center of the 9/11 remembrance community.
And in doing so, she deeply affected real survivors, victims' families, and a community that was, built on shared experience and trust.
It's just essential to state right at the top our deepest sympathy for those authentic survivors and families whose healing was, well, it was cruelly exploited.
It really was. So our goal here is to conduct a really thorough analysis of the documents we have. We want to trace the life of the woman at the center of this, Alicia Esteve Head.
And we need to look at her sort of astonishing rise to prominence within the World Trade Center Survivors Network, the very specific claims she made, and then, of course, the careful process that finally exposed her story.
So let's start with the verifiable facts. Before she was Tania Head, who was Alicia Esteve Head.
Okay, so Alicia Esteve Head was born on July 31st, 1973, in Barcelona, Spain. The sources confirm this.
So she was from Spain, and this wasn't someone who just appeared out of nowhere, right?
Not at all. She came from a pretty prominent, well-established family in Barcelona.
The sources also point to something else in her background, something that might give us a bit of context for her later actions, a public family scandal.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a really crucial piece of background. Her family was involved in a major financial scandal back in Spain in 1992.
A financial scandal?
Yes, and it was significant. Both her father and her brother actually served prison time because of it.
Wow. So growing up, she would have been exposed to public scrutiny, to having her family name in the papers.
Exactly. There was already this family history with notoriety and, public perception. It might, in an odd way, prepared her for navigating public attention and manipulating narratives later on.
That's a fascinating point. It suggests she was already familiar with the idea of a public story, a public reputation.
Even if it was a negative one, yes.
So let's establish her timeline. What was she doing, professionally and academically, right before and during 2001? We need to know where she actually was.
Well, she was an ambitious, educated woman on a very clear career path in Spain. She went to the University of Barcelona. She worked for a Spanish hotel company for a while, Hotel de la Villa Olímpica S.A.
Okay.
Specifically, from 1998 to 2000, she was a management secretary in Barcelona. But the most critical fact, the one that everything else hinges on, is her status in September of 2001.
And the sources are clear on this.
They are definitive. On September 11, 2001, when the attacks happened, Alicia Esteve Head was enrolled in a master's degree program at ESAD. It's a very highly respected business school in Barcelona.
So there it is. We've established her actual location and activities. Now we have to confront the huge contradiction at the heart of this entire story.
And it all starts with that single verifiable fact.
Yeah.
On September 11th, 2001, she was attending classes in Barcelona, Spain.
Thousands of miles away.
Living a completely different life from the one she would later invent.
And she didn't even come to the U.S. immediately. The sources say she traveled here for the first time in 2003.
2 years later. That gap is so telling, isn't it?
It is. It suggests this wasn't an impulsive act. She had time to think, to craft this story, this entire identity.
And by 2004, the persona of Tania Head was ready. That's when she started to connect with the World Trade Center Survivors Network.
But she didn't just walk in the door, did she? Her approach was more strategic than that.
It was very strategic. She didn't initially try to join the existing physical group. First, she created her own online support group.
Under the name Tania Head?
Exactly. And that digital presence acted as, a sort of proof of concept. It established her name and her fabricated story in a space that had much less scrutiny.
So she built this digital shell first. How did she make the leap from that online persona to becoming a leader in the real, legitimate Survivors Network?
Through one of the network's founders, a man named Jerry Bogash. The sources say he found out about this online group run by Tania Head.
And he was impressed by her dedication, presumably.
He was. And this led to months of email correspondence. It's a classic way to build trust without any face-to-face interaction. Eventually, she successfully merged her small online group with the official World Trade Center Survivors Network.
This Survivors Network is so central to the story. Why was it created? What was its purpose?
The network existed to fill a very specific gap in the support system after 9/11. The sources really emphasize this. Public attention and most of the resources were focused on the victims, their families, and the first responders.
Which is completely understandable.
Of course. But there were an estimated 20,000 civilian survivors. People who worked in the towers, visitors, volunteers who managed to escape. And they often felt overlooked, unseen in the larger narrative.
So this was a space for them, a place where they could share this very specific, almost unimaginable trauma with people who truly understood, a place built on shared experience.
Precisely. And that shared trauma, that very foundation, is what made it so vulnerable. You joined because you had lived it. The proof was your story, your pain.
And into this trusting, supportive environment comes Alicia Esteve Head as Tania Head.
And her rise was just meteoric. Her dedication seems so intense, so immediate.
She didn't just join the group, she quickly became its president, which is incredible for someone who was supposedly a relative newcomer.
And here's a detail that made her seem so credible. She was never paid for this work. It was all volunteer.
In fact, she donated her own money to the group.
She did. So in the eyes of the other survivors, she wasn't seeking money or fame. She was just this deeply, selflessly committed person who wanted to help her peers heal.
That lack of a financial motive would have made her seem completely above suspicion.
It speaks to a much more complex motivation, doesn't it? It seems she wasn't after money, she was after something else. Validation, importance, maybe.
Emotional currency, the status that came with being a survivor of that event.
Exactly.
So let's get into the narrative itself. Because the story she constructed was, it was incredibly specific and emotionally resonant.
It was engineered, really,
Right.
perfectly designed to place her right at the physical and emotional heart of the disaster.
The core of it was her location. She claimed to have been inside the South Tower, WTC-2, when the plane hit.
And not just anywhere in the South Tower. Not the lobby, not a low floor. She claimed to be on the 78th floor.
Right in the sky lobby, in the impact zone.
That is the most audacious part of the entire lie. To put that in perspective, we have to look at the numbers. Only 19 people who were at or above the point of impact in the South Tower actually survived.
So by making that claim, she was elevating herself to the status of a miracle survivor, someone who had defied impossible odds.
It made her story instantly powerful, almost mythological. And she had something else, something tangible.
The physical proof. She claimed she'd been severely burned and she had a very visible injury on her arm.
Yes, the sources are clear that everyone who met her saw this injury. A physical scar gave real substance to a completely fictional story.
A scar is powerful evidence. In a community built on shared wounds, both physical and emotional, it would have just stopped questions before they were even asked.
It did. You see the injury, you hear the story, you believe. But she didn't stop with the physical claims. She layered on these deeply emotional details.
The personal loss. She claimed her fiancé, Dave, was killed in the North Tower.
Sometimes she called him her husband, sometimes her fiancé. But the core of that story was consistent. She wasn't just a survivor. She was also a grieving widow.
That dual status is key, isn't it? It allowed her to connect with both survivor groups and victims' family groups.
It maximized her influence across the entire 9/11 community. But the most spectacular part of her story was how she connected it to a real, undisputed hero.
She claimed she was rescued by Wells Crowther.
The man known as the Man in the Red Bandana. His story of heroism is so well known, so much a part of the national memory of that day.
He saved so many people before he lost his own life.
He did. And by claiming he personally saved her, by tying her fictional survival to his very real heroism, she made her story almost untouchable. To question her would feel like questioning him. It was a masterstroke of manipulation.
And there was one more detail she often told, an anecdote designed to be unforgettable.
The wedding ring.
Tell us about that.
She claimed that as she was escaping, a dying man gave her his wedding ring and asked her to give it to his widow.
It's like a scene from a movie. It gives her this sense of sacred duty, of being a witness to a final act of love in the middle of all that chaos.
It transforms her from just a survivor into a messenger, a keeper of a final promise. These are the kinds of details that get repeated that make a story feel deeply true, even with no facts to back it up.
And she wasn't just telling these stories to friends or in small support groups. She was on a public stage.
A very public stage. As president of the network, she regularly gave tours at Ground Zero. She would stand there and say, "I was there at the towers. I'm a survivor. I'm going to tell you about that."
That repetition, that public performance, it would have cemented the lie in the minds of so many people.
It turned her into the public voice of the civilian survivor. The media certainly saw her that way.
She was in newspaper articles, interviewed for anniversary pieces. She became a go-to representative for that group of nearly 20,000 survivors.
And her role became institutionalized. In 2005, she was chosen to lead official tours for the Tribute WTC Visitor Center.
So she had the stamp of approval from an official organization.
She did. And the sources point to photographic evidence of her prominence. There are photos of her with Mayor Michael Bloomberg, with former Mayor Rudy Giuliani, former Governor George Pataki.
These weren't just snapshots. They were taken at official remembrance events. They served as a kind of visual proof of her legitimacy on a national stage.
And the people inside the Survivors Network, the people who knew her best, they believed her completely.
Richard Zimbler, who took over as president after she left, said as much. He said there was no reason to doubt her story.
And his reasoning was so simple and so powerful. He said she had a badly injured arm that looked like it had burn scars, and her story was just very, very realistic.
That trust, born out of this shared vulnerability and what seemed like undeniable physical proof, allowed the deception to last for years.
The emotional cost of questioning a fellow survivor in that kind of environment would be immense. Her story was almost designed to be unquestionable.
But eventually it was questioned, and the entire elaborate fiction began to unravel.
And it started not from within the network, but from the outside, through journalistic due diligence.
This was in September 2007, right? 6 years after the attack.
That's right. The New York Times was working on an anniversary story, and as part of the process, they started to verify some of the key details of Head's account.
And when you start pulling on the threads of a story built on lies,
the whole thing falls apart. They started with her academic credentials. She had used them to bolster her story about having a career on Wall Street.
She claimed degrees from Harvard and Stanford.
Two of the most famous universities in the world, so the Times just...
they call them.
Definitive. Both Harvard and Stanford confirmed they had no record of an Alicia Esteve Head or a Tania Head ever attending, let alone graduating.
So the foundation of her professional life story just crumbled.
Instantly. But the employment claims were even more critical because they were what placed her physically at the World Trade Center that day.
She claimed she worked for Merrill Lynch in the South Tower.
And this is where the lie went from, resume padding to a physical impossibility. First, Merrill Lynch checked their records. No employee by that name.
Which is damning enough.
But the second finding was the knockout blow. Merrill Lynch didn't have any offices in the World Trade Center complex in 2001.
Wait, they weren't even in the buildings at all?
Not at all. That single fact means her entire story, the core of her identity as a survivor, could not possibly be true. She literally invented a workplace that didn't exist there.
That is just astonishing. So when the Times presented her with these discrepancies, how did she react?
She knew the game was up. She immediately went into evasion mode.
She canceled interviews.
3 of them. 3 scheduled interviews with the Times. She just backed out. And then she stopped talking to all reporters completely after years being so public, so vocal, that sudden silence was a confession in itself.
And then there was the story of Big Dave, the fiancé she claimed died in the North Tower.
A huge part of her emotional appeal. The Times approached his family, very respectfully, to verify the relationship.
And what did they find?
The family confirmed they had never, ever heard of a woman named Tania Head.
So the great love story at the heart of her tragedy
Was a complete fantasy. That must have been devastating for the people in the network who had mourned with her for years.
How did the Survivors Network react when the Times brought all of this to them? This must have been an incredible shock.
The shock was immense, but their action was swift. Once the facts were laid out, no degrees, no job at Merrill Lynch, no fiancé, they had to confront the reality.
I took a vote.
Yes.
Yeah.
By the last week of September 2007, the group held a vote, and they removed her as president and director.
I can't even imagine the sense of betrayal. To build a community on shared suffering and then to find out your leader's suffering was a performance.
The violation of trust in that kind of safe, intimate space is just. It's immeasurable.
And the final definitive proof of where she really was on 9/11 came from her home country.
That's right. A newspaper in Barcelona, La Vanguardia, was the one that ultimately put the final nail in the coffin. They had access to local records and classmates.
And they confirmed what the Times had uncovered.
They did more than that. They confirmed with evidence that Alicia Esteve Head was physically attending classes at ISAD in Barcelona on September 11th, 2001.
She was in school.
In school. And she continued in that master's program until June of 2002. She completed almost the entire academic year after the attacks.
Which means she was likely planning this, conceptualizing the Tania Head persona, while she was still a student in Spain.
It seems so. Classmates even recalled her talking about wanting to move to New York someday.
This brings us back to the scar, the one piece of physical evidence that made her story so believable for so long. If she wasn't burned in the towers, where did it come from?
Well, the sources show she had other stories for that scar, long before she ever came to America. Her classmates in Barcelona remembered her telling them it was from either a car accident or a horse riding accident.
So she had a real injury.
A real injury, but with a completely different origin story. A 2012 documentary on the case specified that the injury was from a rollover accident while she was traveling along the coast of Spain. She repurposed a real scar for her fictional trauma.
So once the story was completely exposed internationally, what was the immediate fallout for her?
She vanished. She left Manhattan immediately, refused all interviews, and just retreated from public life entirely. The Tania Head identity she'd spent years building was just gone, extinguished overnight.
But the manipulation didn't completely stop, did it? There was one more really disturbing act.
It's quite chilling. In February 2008, a few months after the exposure, an anonymous email was sent from a Spanish email account to the members of the Survivors Network.
And what did it say?
It claimed that Alicia Esteve Head had died by suicide.
Wow. A final attempt to control the narrative, to generate sympathy.
And maybe to stop any further investigation into her life. But the sources confirmed later that this, too, was a lie. She was alive and well.
Despite her trying to disappear, this story was just too big to go away. It became a case study, really.
It did. In 2012, a book and a documentary film came out, both with the same title, The Woman Who Wasn't There.
And they were incredibly detailed, weren't they? They actually had interviews with her.
That's what makes them so unique. They include interviews with Head and with network members from before the hoax was exposed and then again after. So you get to see the illusion, and then you see the painful reality of its collapse.
And even after all that, she didn't manage to stay completely out of the public eye.
No. The sources mentioned that in September of 2011, she was spotted in New York City with her mother.
And who saw her?
The director of the documentary and the co-author of the book. They actually confronted her on camera, forcing her to, face her old life again, if only for a moment.
And the consequences of what she did in New York eventually followed her back to Spain.
They did. The story of the deception was so widely reported that it eventually reached her employers in Barcelona. In July 2012, she was fired from her job at an insurance company, Interpartner Assistance, once they learned about the scale of the fraud she'd committed.
So after all the dust settled, what do we know about her life now?
The sources give us a small update. As of 2021, she seems to have returned to the business world in Barcelona. She opened a renovation company in the city.
So a definitive return to her old life and the end of the Tania Head era.
It seems so.
As we wrap this up, it's worth summarizing what we've learned from these sources. The deception was just so total.
It really was. The core finding is this stark, verifiable contrast. On one side, you have the real Alicia Esteve Head, the educated management secretary and student safe in Barcelona. On the other, the invented Tania Head, the heroic survivor, the grieving widow, the woman saved by a national hero.
And at the center of it all is this profound violation of trust. The Survivors Network was created for healing based on a shared, authentic trauma. When she inserted this fiction into that sacred space, it must have been devastating.
It forces genuine survivors to look back at their own healing, at their own vulnerability, and see it through a lens of betrayal. It's a terrible thing to do to people who have already suffered so much.
It really raises questions about why someone would do this. It wasn't for money. It seems to be about something deeper.
It seems to be about a desire for significance. She craved the status of a survivor, that connection to defining historical tragedy. It points to this very human, if deeply misguided, need to feel connected to history, no matter what the ethical cost.
And that leads us to a final thought for you to consider. The sources here demonstrate the immense power of an emotional narrative. The Tania Head story was so successful for so long because it was exactly what people wanted and needed to hear.
It was a story of ultimate survival, of heroism, of love and loss. It was powerful.
It was. And the scar, the connection to Wells Crowther, all of it allowed her to bypass rational checks for years. It shows us that when a story aligns perfectly with our emotional desire for meaning in the face of tragedy, it can become incredibly difficult to challenge, even when the verifiable facts, like a company not having an office in the building, are sitting right there. This whole case is a powerful cautionary tale about the allure of being close to history and the profound responsibility that comes with talking about shared trauma and loss. Thank you for engaging with this examination of the source material.
It's been a complex, but I think necessary analysis of the facts.
Thanks for listening.